Morning or good afternoon, depending upon where in the world you are at this moment. Let me welcome you to another conversation in the series between the Florida International University's Latin American and Caribbean Center and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. My name is Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith. I happen to have the distinct honor of moderating this conversation as a member of the CPC, and incidentally, having spent more than a decade at FIU as a professor and a dean way back when. Before I introduce the panelists and offer a little context for the conversation, it's my pleasure to invite the director of LAC, Dr. Anthony Pereira, to offer a few comments. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Ivelaw. I'm Tony Pereira, Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. I'm really pleased to be here for the second of our webinars with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. This particular topic, because I lived in London for the last 12 years before coming to FIU, this is particularly of interest to me. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about the relationship between the Caribbean, especially the English-speaking Caribbean, and the UK and the EU. And this is very much part of what we want to do. A lot of Latin American centers sort of add the Caribbean on as an add-on, as an afterthought. We very much see it as central to our mission, partly because of where we are. You know, in Miami, we are affected by most things that affect the Caribbean. So I'm going to stop now, and I look forward, and I want to thank, in advance the participants for coming and giving us their insights. Thank you.
Thank you much, Tony. This conversation, as Tony adverted to, is about EU, Britain, and the Caribbean relations. And we have a wonderful panel of experts who will help us understand and be engaged in that conversation. But I want to, before introducing the panelists, I want to offer one contextual comment. You know, perhaps the most well-known British Prime Minister in the 20th century would have been Winston Churchill. When Winston Churchill left office, retired as Prime Minister in 1955, he was succeeded by his Foreign Secretary, Sir Anthony Eden. And I want to share one very prescient observation by Anthony Eden that I think would set the stage for the conversation this morning/afternoon. Now, here's what Anthony Eden said, that I think is quite relevant to this conversation. He said, "There is nothing more dangerous than a foreign policy based on unreality. There is nothing more dangerous than a foreign policy based on unreality." What Anthony Eden was advocating in that speech was the necessity for periodic reality checks in regards to foreign policy. And I would argue that although he was referring to that reality checking in a bilateral context, the proposition could be made that reality checking is necessary whether it's multilateral or bilateral, whether it's between relations between one country and a group of countries or between groups of countries. And so what this conversation is all about is, in essence, a reality check on relations between the European Union and the Caribbean, relations between Britain and the Caribbean. And we have an expert panel to help us undertake that reality check-in. Let me tell you who those experts are. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and they'll each speak for 12 to 15 minutes, after which we'll have a conversation with questions and answers going on. Dr. Annita Montoute, who will begin the reality checking looking at the overall contemporary dynamics between the CARICOM and the EU. She is Interim Director of the Institute of International Relations at UWI St. Augustine, based in Trinidad and Tobago. She lectures in global governance and international organization and Global African Studies program at the UWI and the University of Johannesburg. There's a partnership between the two universities. She was a research fellow at the European Center for Development Policy Management in Maastricht, the Netherlands. And Anita's research interests include civil society and global governance, Caribbean's external relations, and China in the Caribbean. Annita holds a PhD in international relations from the UWI. We will then hear from Dr. Paul Sutton. Paul will focus his attention and do his reality check in relation to British overseas territories and the relationship with the United Kingdom. But I've also asked Paul to broaden the ambit of his reality checking to look at the overseas countries and territories relationship with the EU writ large. Paul is a retired British academic who taught and researched the Caribbean for over many years in the United Kingdom, and he taught for a semester as well at Florida International University. Paul is the author or editor of 10 books on the Caribbean, including a very splendidly done Europe and the Caribbean. He's also authored more than 50 articles and papers on the region. Paul has worked as a consultant on EU Caribbean issues for the Caribbean Council in the UK and the West Indian Commission. He's given evidence before House of Commons committees on Caribbean matters, and he also had the distinct honor of serving as chair of the Society of Caribbean Studies and the UK Caribbean Chamber of Commerce. We'll then hear from Tim. Tim will look at the implications of Brexit for the region, but I've also asked Tim to say a little bit about Canada's relationship with the Caribbean. Dr. Tim Shaw holds a trio of degrees from universities from 3 different continents, including Makerere in Uganda and Princeton in the USA. After a quarter-century teaching at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, he directed the Institute for Commonwealth Studies in London and the Institute of International Relations at St. Augustine. Most recently, he served as foundation chair for a new PhD program in global governance and human security at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In his spare moment in his retirement, 5th or 6th retirement, Tim, he continues to edit book series for Palgrave Macmillan on international political economy and Rutledge on new regionalisms. I might add that I'm right now working on a book for one of Tim's series. And we'll end the reality checking with a slightly different kind of reality checking. We know that there's been an interest in many parts of the former British Empire, colonize, decolonize, to delink from the monarchy. Barbados took the step in November 2021, and Jamaica contemplates moving along in that direction. So I've asked Earl to talk a little bit about how Jamaica is setting the stage for that delinking from the British monarchy. Earl is a distinguished journalist with more than 3 decades of experience, working principally within Jamaica, but also for the Caribbean Media Corporation and for Reuters. Most of his career has been with what is now the RJR Galena Communications Group, which has allowed him over the decades to work in radio, in television, and in print. He started with Radio Jamaica in 1992. Earl currently is Special Assignments Editor of the RJR Galena Group. He's also distinguished himself in having on more than one occasion been named Journalist of the Year by the Press Association of Jamaica. And he also is a recipient of many awards in media from Caribbean Broadcasting Union. Earl holds a bachelor's in Library Information Studies from the University of the West Indies and an LLB from the University of London. I'm hoping that Earl might be able during his presentation to hold up his recently published book called Vantage Point Jamaica, a Reporter's Chronicle. So ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a treat with reality checking of various dimensions of the contemporary scenario, Caribbean and Europe, Caribbean and Britain. And it's my pleasure now to invite the first speaker, Dr. Montoute, to take the floor, to take the virtual floor. Over to you, Annita.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to, for my presentation, I'd like to trace the EU CARICOM relationship mainly via the ACP framework up to the new post-Cotonou agreement that we know was initial in 2021, and see some of the challenges and opportunities in that context. So I want to start by saying that CARICOM has traditionally engaged with Europe as a bloc, either as the European Economic Community, EEC, or the EU, through the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of countries, now the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. The framework within which this relationship was initially conducted was the Lomé Conventions, which were preferential trade and aid agreements. And we know that there were 4 of them, lasting from 1975 to 1999. And the Cotonou Partnership Agreement was signed in 2000 for 10 years until 2020. It has now been extended to June 2023. The post-Cotonou Partnership Agreement was initialed with the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States in 2021 and will replace the Cotonou Agreement once it has been initialed and once it has been put in force or provisionally applied. Now, the Lomé Conventions, the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, and now the post-Cotonou Partnership Agreement point to tectonic shifts or radical turning points in the global political economy and in the nature of the EU's relationship with the ACP, or the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States, of which the Caribbean is a part. I think it is important to look at this presentation not only in technical terms, but to put it in a broader political context and look at the political economy and the broader issues within which this relationship is framed. So this is what I'm going to try to do as I move along, especially in the introductory part, to locate and to understand some of the more technical aspects that I will be dealing with later. The Lomé Conventions, with its preferential trade and aid features, were designed in the context of decolonization and the reconstruction of North-South relations in light of the legacy of structural inequalities. Preferences and aid were in keeping with the demands of developing countries for a new international economic order to bring about a just world order. The Cotonou Agreement in 2000, on the other hand, reflected the neoliberalization of North-South relations and global development models, which envisage reciprocity in the trade relationship via the Economic Partnership Agreement. The post-Cotonou Partnership Agreement reflects the elevation of the EU's rights-based approach to development in its relationship with the ACP and the Caribbean by extension. Additionally, it illustrates the EU's determination to advance its normative political agendas in multilateral fora through the ACP and the Caribbean by extension. The agreement also represents the EU's escalation of its global strategy and political prowess vis-a-vis China. Now, the Lomé Development Aid was dispersed primarily through the European Development Fund and was managed by the Caribbean Community or CARICOM Secretariat up to Lomé 3. However, for Lomé 4, the CARICOM framework could no longer suffice because the 2 new Caribbean ACP states, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, who were not members of CARICOM, became signatories of the Georgetown Agreement and the Lomé Convention. The Caribbean Forum of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, CARIFORUM, was therefore established as a political group in October 1992 to provide a forum for consultation and to manage and coordinate policy dialogue between the Caribbean region and the European Union. Since 2016, the EU has had formalized accreditation of its ambassadors in Barbados to the Caribbean community. There are dedicated focal points at technical level in the EU delegation and the CARICOM Secretariat. The EU's relationship with CARICOM/CARIFORUM is based on 3 pillars of trade. They are trade, development, cooperation, and political dialogue, and is shaped by various overlapping frameworks. Among the most notable is the Cotonou Agreement, which I spoke about earlier on, which was signed in 2000 until 2020. 3 of the main changes, that particular agreement was very significant because it really represented some of the geopolitical changes as well as developments in the various regions. I want to highlight some of the changes, including the introduction of political dialogue as the 3rd pillar of the relationship, which gave a central role to political values in the ACP-EU relationship. The other change was the introduction of reciprocal liberalized trade relations between the ACP and the EU, again, via the Economic Partnership Agreement. This included the end of special preferential commodity protocols, such as the ones for bananas and sugar. The EPA also marked a significant shift from the non-reciprocal trade provisions on the LOME. The other change was the introduction of regionalization of the trade relationship, also through the EPA, where there was a moving away from an all ACP framework to trade agreements with regions and sub-regions within the ACP. I now want to look at the EU-CARICOM relationship in various aspects, then outline some of the new changes in the post-Cotonou framework and what that could mean for us. In the area of trade and economic cooperation, I'm going to lean heavily on a very good paper that was written by Lodge and Remy in 2021. It's quite current and quite good, I found, in terms of evaluating the various aspects of the relationship. According to Lodge and Remy, they said that the EU continues to be a major trading partner to the Caribbean, ranking 3rd as a source of imports and 3rd as an export destination. The CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, signed in 2008 was the first regional partnership agreement signed with the EU in the ACP, among the ACP countries. The authors state further that since the EU CEPA came into force 12 years ago, the agreement has not met its objectives, with the value of CARIFORUM EU merchandise trade decreasing from euro 9.5 billion in 2008 to 8.82 billion in 2020. Secondly, there has not been an increase in Caribbean exports. Thirdly, the agreement has not reconfigured, and that's my own interpretation of what was said. The agreement has not reconfigured the place of the CARIFORUM/CARICOM in the International Division of Labor. CARICOM countries continue to be exports of predominantly primary products, with EU countries exporting mainly manufactured products to CARICOM. For instance, in 2020, CARIFORUM exports consisted of 6.3% of primary products and 32% of manufactured goods, while the EU exports to CARIFORUM consisted of 68.5% manufactured goods and 28% of primary products. In sharp contrast, the EU has benefited from the agreement, where the EU has had a trade surplus of euros 2.032 billion in 2020, up from a trade deficit of euro 1.495 billion in 2008 with CARIFORUM. Now, the story is different for CARIFORUM service exports to the EU, which saw marked increases from euro 22.295 billion in 2015 to 29.84 billion in 2019. Now, several factors have been cited by the authors and by other sources about why it is that we have not seen the desired outcome from that trade pact. And these include, for example, falling energy prices, the global economic crisis, changes in EU commodity import regimes, and the favorable EU export performance can be attributed to the opening of Caribbean markets and enhanced competitiveness in agricultural production due to the common external tariff reform, common agricultural policy reform, evidenced by a marked increase in food product exports to the Caribbean since the EPA came into effect. Now, it was anticipated that Brexit Now, I do not have much about Brexit, so I'm glad that that will be filled. But it's important to say that it was expected that Brexit would have an adverse impact on the Caribbean's goods exports to the EU, given the UK's importance as a trade destination for CARIFORUM products. While Brexit negatively affected the value of CARICOM EU trade arrangements, the fullest impact was offset by the rollover of the CEPA EU trade preferences through the CARIFORUM UK Economic Partnership Agreement. At the same time, the UK's exit from the EU means that the Caribbean has lost its main ally in the EU framework, given the UK's support in the EU-US dispute on bananas, and more recently on securing advanced commitments for Caribbean services suppliers to access the EU market under the CEPA. Overall, the Caribbean has not been able to convert, and I heard the Director General saying this in a conference where, in a webinar where he said that the Caribbean has not been able to convert negotiated market access into market presence for goods and services. And I'm referring to the Director General of CARIFORUM. However, he said small but steady steps have been taken to address some of these constraints in that aspect of the relationship. For example, capacity building initiatives, most of which is supported by financial or technical assistance by the EU. For example, Caribbean Export operates a €27 million for trade and private sector program for private sector development. It provides direct assistance to the private sector and individual enterprises in various areas. Another initiative he mentioned is that there is a facility in the Caribbean Development Bank which countries can access at the national level to build private sector capacity. And he said that includes for SMEs, and he gave the case of something happening in that area in Jamaica. In the area of development cooperation, the EU also remains a significant source of development cooperation, and the EDF was the main means of funding for the Caribbean, of course, within the ACP framework. And the EDF up to 2021 was an instrument distinct from the general EU budget, which was financed by member states' budgeted contributions and administered by the European Commission. It was allocated to the ACP to support activities in the sphere of economic, social, human development, and regional cooperation. And I have a number of projects there, EDF funding covered. And I just want to go down to the 11th EDF, which had 22 projects implemented. And Lodge and Remy commented that this quote underscores both the breadth of Caribbean development needs and the limits of aid effectiveness when financial resources are so thinly spread, end of quote. Now, the EDF was not only about a transfer of resources, but facilitated preferential treatment for bids of some categories of East ACP firms. It also utilized ACP nationals, it utilized the technical expertise and possible additional support to ACP-owned companies and experts. Now, moving to political relations, political dialogue has been and is increasingly becoming a sore or sour point in the relationship. And I'll give an example later down, but I just want to give the broad frame is that it has always been an important aspect of the relationship. It takes place at various levels and in various forms. And ACP and EU emphasis on the political dimension of development processes grew rapidly in the 1990s. Now, Cotonou expanded the phenomenon of political dialogue and established it as one of the three pillars of the ACP-EU partnership, which could cut across all the aims and objectives of the agreement. And civil society actors were to be part of this political dialogue. It's also important to note that political dialogue doesn't only take place at the regional level in the context of the EPAs, but also it takes place between CARICOM and the EU at the EU or ACP level /ACP level previously, including the ACP-EU Council of Ministers, the ACP-EU Committee of Ambassadors, etc. In 2012, the Joint Caribbean-EU Partnership Strategy was introduced to encourage regular high-level political dialogue between the EU and the Caribbean. The 2014-2020 strategy covered 5 areas, including regional integration, reconstruction of Haiti, climate change and natural disasters, crime and security, and joint action in multilateral fora. Now, as part of the EU Global Gateway Strategy, the European Union's cooperation with the Caribbean for 2021-2027 is framed by partnerships in 3 specific areas, including one, the Green Deal, economic resilience and trade, and governance, security, and human resources. As part of these partnerships, CARICOM ministers also agreed on concrete actions to fight climate change, protect biodiversity, foster digital transformation, mobility of students and university staff. Now, the political relationship between the Caribbean and the EU has not been without problems and have not always met the objective of supporting each other's development priorities and positions in international fora. I'm going to cite a notable example there, and that is the EU's blacklisting of some Caribbean states. Caribbean countries have been identified as being non-cooperative tax jurisdictions and being deficient in the area of anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism regulations. CARICOM has labeled the EU's blacklisting actions as unilateral, arbitrary, and non-transparent, and highlight the EU's unwillingness to take into account the remarkable progress made by CARICOM member states at compliance with global standards. Now I move to the post-Cotonou partnership agreement, which represents additional changes in the relationship, and I just want to highlight a few. And the first one is that it is seen to be a political agreement which seeks to move beyond the donor-recipient relationship towards becoming a partnership of equals for generating mutually beneficial outcomes. It has the aim of promoting sustainable development, not just for the ACP, as was previously articulated, but also for the EU. EU funding for most of its development programs for ACP countries and by extension Caribbean countries will be through the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe, called the NDICI. The geographical component will promote partnerships, it is said, through cooperation with partner countries in several regions, and we will be lumped with Latin America. So one of the regions is the Americas and the Caribbean. The European Development Fund, which was funded by direct contribution from member states, ceases to exist as of 2021. Now, while this could mean the dilution of CARICOM specific priorities, Lodge and Remy suggest that this approach can be leveraged to promote wider Caribbean integration by triangulating CARIFORUM cooperation with Cuba and with Caribbean ORs and OCTs, including UK territories and with other regional groupings like the ACS.
I need to take 1 minute more.
Okay, thank you. The agreement includes a common foundation of the OACP level combined with 3 regional protocols for Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And then I will just list quickly some of the priorities under the Caribbean protocol: fighting against climate change, economic transformation, diversification, promoting citizen security, increasing investment in human and social development. And finally, I have in my last set of notes that, of course, we also relate with the EU within the EU LAC framework, as well as there are individual relations with EU countries, of CARICOM countries, as well as individual European countries with CARICOM as a group. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. A virtual round of applause for Dr. Annita Montoute. Before I invite Dr. Sutton, let me encourage participants in the webinar to send any questions they have through the Q&A, and we'll assemble them. When all the presentations will have been made, we'll turn to the Q&A section, and I'll take bundles of 2 or 3 questions and have the conversation around those questions. Delighted now to invite Dr. Paul Sutton to do his reality checking. Paul?
Thank you, Ivor Law, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. Basically, we have to begin with the realization that Britain as a whole, its foreign policy is in a long process of withdrawal from the Caribbean, which started in 1962 and is continuing today, as Her Majesty's head will disappear off some of the banknotes from the Eastern Caribbean as they all become republics. So that process of withdrawal is continuing, but for 6 territories, it won't happen. And I'm here talking about the British overseas territories in the Caribbean, which are still organized and basically maintained by Britain, and which show no sign of wanting to leave Britain. So Britain is bound with them for the future. There are 6 of them in the Caribbean, with a population of 217,000, There are Anguilla, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Montserrat, Caicos Islands, and Bermuda, which is counted as Caribbean. The largest of them in population terms is Cayman with 66,000, smallest Montserrat with 5,000. All of them are high per capita, well, 3 of them are high per capita income countries. Bermuda is sometimes cited as the highest in the world. It changes ranks with Luxembourg. At present, it's got 83,000 US dollars per capita as its income. British Virgin Islands and Cayman have around 50,000 US dollars. Go down a bit, Anguillas has about 22, Turks and Caicos 18, finally Montserrat, smallest, only 13,000 US dollars. These countries run their home affairs, their internal affairs. They elect an assembly, the assembly chooses a prime minister, chief minister, he runs the business. But Britain is still responsible for their foreign and defence affairs, and it does so via placing a governor in the island, who also provides some oversight into their affairs. The governor is appointed and is an official of the British Foreign Office. He is not elected. The governor usually serves about 3 to 6 years in those countries. The governor can also have some oversight over money in Anguilla, Turks and Caicos Islands, and sometimes over governance issues, and has suspended the constitutions. I'll come on to that. The overseas minister, the chief ministers of these territories, come to London every year, where they meet in the Foreign Office and have an overseas countries and territories conference for a couple of days where they discuss their issues. And we're not talking just about the Caribbean here, we're talking about places like the Falkland Islands as well as an overseas territory in this instance. How does Brexit affect us? Well, before Brexit, the British overseas territories in the region had exactly the same rights as the Dutch ones, places like Curacao, Aruba, St. Martin, and as the French overseas territories as well, places like French St. Martin and St. Bart's. Now that Brexit has happened, they are no longer a European overseas country and territory. They are British. They are simply a British one. And that has affected their questions of their access to markets and has affected their development system. After Brexit happened, the UK government asked for the OCTs, for the British overseas territories and OCTs, to be part of the UK trade deal, but the European Union refused. So they are not part of that, and they are out of that. So that clearly means they have to have established a separate relationship to Europe than is the general relationship to Europe, which Britain have. The chief ministers of the British overseas territories came to London in 2017 and put forward their concerns. The Brexit referendum was in 2016, and they said that their concerns were over access to trade and of people to Europe for travel, funding, money they would lose because they had development assistance, and problems of the environment. There was also special issues for Anguilla and Montserrat, which I'll touch on. A couple of years ago, following Brexit, they again, the UK Overseas Territories Associations met again in London and called it a challenging situation with regards to Europe, because nothing has been organised or fixed. Let's turn first to trade and people. The overseas territories are not automatically part of any trade deals that the United Kingdom negotiates. As we can see, they can ask, but they don't necessarily have to be accommodated. The trade, as far as Britain is concerned, of the OCTs, is dominated by services. We know that 3 of them are heavily involved in financial services. That's Cayman Islands, which does banking. British Virgin Islands, which does offshore companies, and Bermuda, which deals with offshore finance. Their exports are nearly all services. For example, 98% of Cayman's exports to the EU are services, to the UK are services, and 100% of his imports. So in other words, basically trade doesn't matter other than service trade. And services are, as we see, dominated by finance. The overseas territories worry that now the UK has withdrawn, as Annita mentioned, they can't influence EU rules on offshore finance. And yes, some years ago in the EU, all of them, Cayman, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos Islands, Anguilla, Bermuda, BVI, were all found to be non-compliant on international tax standards by the EU. Since then, there has been certain changes, particularly by places like Caymans and BVI and Bermuda, and now it's only Anguilla and Turks and Caicos Islands EU find as non-compliant. As far as trading goods are concerned, I don't think it needs to concern us because it happens to be literally minimal. Though I do know that from the European Union, the Cayman Islands, BVI and Bermuda import something like 1,245 million euros of products, and I presume that that's all champagne. Because I mention that because when I go in the Cayman Islands, there's certainly more Rolls Royces and Bentleys on the streets of Cayman Islands with its population of 66,000 than there is in Glasgow with its population of 1 million. Turning to people, the overseas countries and territories, people are British residents and they have exactly the same rights, more or less, as British ones. There's also a special status which was offered some years ago for the overseas territories, but very few people have taken that. So their access to Europe basically is the same, more or less, as British access. That is, there is limitations on time. They have to have their passport stamped when they go into Europe, stamped, and they come out and so on. So they are granted the same access as European countries. Turning to development assistance, the OCTs, since they're non-independent, are not able to access IMF or World Bank funding or any of the funds that might be like, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank. They do have a little bit of access by Caribbean, but that's another matter. Basically, they're limited on their development assistance and rely particularly heavily on the United Kingdom, and previously they were able to get money from the European Union as development assistance funding. The UK, in its development assistance programs, says, and it's their first line in their programs, that the overseas territories have, quote, first call on the aid budget, unquote. Fine, it can say so, but they're all regarded as too rich to qualify, and only Montserrat in the Caribbean qualifies for any aid from Britain. From 2016 to 21, Montserrat, remember it's got a population of 5,000, got 168 million pounds from the British government. For example, in 2021, it was 27 million. They can also get UK funding over and above that for national disasters, hurricane disasters in particular, as we can say, like 2017, 2018, Hurricane Irma, all of the overseas territories, 4 of them, Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, British Virgin Islands, and Montserrat, got 90 million to support them in that year from the British government as funding for that time. They also, as I said, were able to get funding from the EU. They were able to get funding from the European Development Fund, which is a fund which is also open to CARICOM countries on the more or less on the same terms and remains to them. 3 countries got funding under the EDF. Anguilla got 12.7 million pounds for education. Montserrat got 16.6 million pounds for sustainable growth, and Turks and Caicos Islands got 13.2 million as well for budget and education allocation. The loss of these was considerable, actually, at that time. It was worth getting. For example, it was 36% of the capital funding in Anguilla before Brexit happened. The UK government has asserted that all of them, that this money will somehow be made up. The EDF is running until 2024. That is, that the funding can be spent up to the end of 2024 for those countries which still haven't spent it all. But after that, the British government still hasn't come up with any funding for them, as far as I am aware. There's also some British funding for something called the Conflict, Stability and Security funding, which is a general fund. Over 85 countries benefit from it, and it's about governance, economic crime, biodiversity, justice, COVID-19, and then so on. General series of projects, but the overseas territories just have access to this on more or less the same terms as the other, and they have been given some money, but not a great deal. Lastly, there's environmental funding. The United Kingdom's overseas territories, that's all of them, there's 12 of them altogether, 6 in the Caribbean, contain 94% the unique species in the United Kingdom. So the UK has only got 6% in terms of biodiversity of species. And of course, that's because we're talking about places like the Falklands, Tristan da Cunha, the Caribbean islands and so on, Antarctica and so on, Pitcairn Island out in the Pacific, which have got enormous as insular biodiversity to them. The environment issues aren't just biodiversity, but increasingly in recent years as islands, issues such as climate change have climbed up the ladder of importance to them. The EU used to offer a system called the Biodiversity and Ecosystems Fund. That was additional to the European Development Fund for these countries. And the UK overseas territories used to get about £1 million a year between all of them for that. So only a smaller amount for the Caribbean. And it would spend on projects, low scale, low level projects, like, for example, turtles in conserving turtles in Anguilla. The United Kingdom also has an overseas territories fund on biodiversity. It's called Darwin Plus, as you might expect if it's biodiversity. And in 2012 to 22, that's over 10 years, gave £38 million to the overseas territories, all of them collectively on that. So those were the 3 key issues. There were access to trade and to Europe for people, development funding, and the future. As we can see, there have been limitations on all this, but we must say that basically those limitations have not been overwhelming. There are problems for 2 countries in particular, Anguilla, which actually has the most, because of course Anguilla is heavily dependent on next door St. Martin for a lot of its imports of food, electricity, for access for health and so on. Also, Montserrat is dependent on access for health in particular to Guadeloupe, but also to those countries. But they're 2 small countries basically, but they do rely heavily on the French Dom of the collectivity of St. Martin and the French Dom of St. Martin for them. So apart from that, those 2 countries, the rest can live with Brexit quite easily. In fact, given their financial basis, then the United States is certainly as important to them, certainly to Cayman, BVI and Bermuda, as Europe is. And of course, Europe, as we know, there are issues with finance, but as I pointed out, that's been development. Tourism for the same. Add here the Turks and Caicos Islands. Tourism from Europe is important, but tourism from the United States and from Canada is just as important for those countries. So the Union can be managed. The United Kingdom Overseas Territories Association, that's when they all get together amongst themselves, and that's when they have their annual meeting with the United Kingdom. They run offices in London as well. They signed a memorandum of understanding last year. No, was it? No, the year before last. No, sorry, got that wrong. In December 2019, some years ago, they signed a memorandum of understanding with the Overseas Countries and Territories Association. That's the same sort of association based in Brussels for the Belgian overseas, for the French overseas territories and for the Dutch overseas territories, and represents them to the European Commission. And in that, they talked about collaborating between the two in climate change, biodiversity, ocean energy, post-COVID economic reconstruction, if it happened, and so on. Has anything happened? Nothing has happened. And I'm not surprised that nothing has happened. Some years ago, I did some work in the region, 2010, 2011, published an article in the European Review of Latin American and Caribbean Studies on regional cooperation between the British overseas territories, the French ones, the Dutch ones, the French Dom, CARICOM, and in which I pointed out, traveled around all the countries, many of the countries, spoke to their leaders. They all said, yes, we would like greater regional integration, but no action followed. And that's where I think we are as well at the moment.
Thank you. Another splendid reality check, reminiscent of Anthony Eden's proposition that there's nothing more dangerous than a foreign policy based on reality. Let's turn now to Dr. Timothy Shaw for his reality check regarding Brexit on the one hand and Canada, Caribbean on the other hand. Please, the floor is yours, Tim.
Hopefully you can now hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
I was concerned that by the time the panel got to me, everything would have been said. But happily, some of my retirement reflections on the state of the world from a very snowy Ottawa have not entirely been directed. And I'm glad that Ivy Law allows me to talk about Canada and the US, because I think they become ever more important to the Caribbean as Brexit complicates or dilutes anything that Britain might be trying to produce. And I'm very glad, as Ivy Law suggested, that he's working on a new collection on the fastest growing economy in the world, which is Guyana, because of its new energy resources. And I have one correction for the previous speaker, that if you look at the annual Economist World In, for the last couple of years, by far the most affluent part of the European Union is Ireland, over 115,000 per annum. So again, the border between Northern Ireland and ERA is increasingly unequal. Finally, nobody has yet mentioned Ukraine. And Ukraine is changing all sorts of things, including the balance of forces inside the EU towards the East, and is not about to go away anytime soon. And the fact that the president of Ukraine was in Britain and Paris the last couple of days is symptomatic. So I think we have to situate what is happening in the Caribbean in part in the context of a changing global political economy. And we also have to recognize the dramatic changes in technologies as well as environment that are occurring. So I would emphasize, and this is partially based on working at the Institute of International Relations at St. Augustine, the transnational as well as the interstate, because Caribbean communities, particularly Guyana, which has more citizens outside the country than inside to date. The transnational is crucial, and new technologies like the internet and the cell phone mean the Caribbean communities in Canada, the US, UK, Europe are in touch with their islands on a daily basis. I would also emphasize, obviously, and this is nothing new to the panelists, migrations and diasporas, that the islands cannot rely on a very fickle and impoverished Brexit, and so increasingly rely on their own communities, where the value of the currency, unlike the pound sterling, has not gone down to the same extent. So I think the whole question of what is development in 2023 is crucial, and we have to recognize that the rise of the BRICS, including China as the leading source of tourism globally, is of continuing importance, but also the emerging markets outside of the BRICS forum. And clearly we have to deal, and this isn't just beating up on Jamaica, we also have to recognize the role of the informal and the illegal, in part because once you're on a plane from the overseas territories to Europe, you're already home and dry, and so smuggling becomes relatively easy. We also have to recognize that the world is changing, and things like the UK automobile industry are dying, and the Biden speech a couple of nights ago about buying America are a threat to the rest of the world. He didn't seem to recognize that the US, along with Canada and Mexico, were part of a free trade agreement. Brexit has also led, very sadly, to a decline not only in British finance, but also a decline in British influence, as in DFID, which was certainly primus inter pares in terms of aid policy in the EU. And for Caribbean communities, Britain was never in Schengen, but certainly there are growing challenges to visa requirements in terms of Britain versus the Schengen community, to the extent that thousands of Brits have been kicked out of the EU in recent months because they were late in filing to remain in the EU after Britain was no longer in the EU. So I think that the place of the ACP is shrinking, in part because the EU is not only concerned about Ukraine, but is very much concerned with Africa, with Asia, etc. So Caribbean tourism may at last be reviving, but obviously it's crucial for the Caribbean to attract Chinese tourists as the biggest source of tourists globally. This all, I think, leads us to have to rethink what we mean by development, what we mean by CARICOM, etc. And all that in a case where obviously climate change is continuing to impact. One of the fringe benefits of being in Trinidad is it's below the hurricane belt, but obviously the rest of the Caribbean has been very badly hit by climate change. So I will leave it there and encourage us to rethink what is CARICOM, what is the Caribbean, what is development, what is political economy in 2023. And unfortunately, not all our colleagues are quite as willing to rethink. It's not easy, but any sense of the changing movement of technologies, let alone religions and fundamentalists and Protestants, Pentecostals, means that we all have to, I think, have an increasingly open mind. And as Ivor very kindly said, my book series forced me to learn on a daily basis. So I look forward to further discussions informed by this very interesting but changeable region of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Reality checking. I want to pick up on one of the terms Tim used as we move to the next speaker, and that is rethinking. Clearly, Jamaica has been rethinking its relationship with the monarchy, and I'm delighted that we have a practitioner of the media arts and a lawyer who can help us to get a sense of what that rethinking, reality checking is all about. So I'm delighted now to invite Earl to share what he has in mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Avilo. And I'm very pleased to be part of this very important forum today. Before I get into the substance of my own presentation, I would just like to, in perhaps 30 seconds, draw your attention to what I think is an important issue. It has had an emerging issue now, which has become well established, and which certainly I believe will have an impact on the relationship between CARICOM countries and certain EU states and the UK, if not the formal institutions of the EU. And that is the question of reparations. And interestingly, today, an important Jamaican jurist is heading or is featured in a very important forum, a symposium, Reparations under International Law for Enslavement of African Persons in the Americas and the Caribbean. And this is being put on under the auspices of the American Society of International Law. And the aim there is ultimately to quantify the monetary damages that should be paid for those European states that engaged in the horrific practice of slavery. And of course, there is the matter of Haiti and the reparations that Haiti was forced to pay to France for more than a century following its own revolution to rid itself of the shackles of enslavement and the French colonial exploitation. So I think that that is something that, in a sense, will affect and continue to affect the relationship between Caribbean and CARICOM countries. And if not, as I said, the EU as a formal institution, certainly particular member states within the EU and the UK. But let me now switch from that, having taken a little bit of liberty there, to the matter of constitutional reform in Jamaica. I formally entered the field of journalism in June 1992, and within a few months was covering the proceedings of the Jamaican Parliament. It was not long before I was engrossed in the meetings of the Joint Select Committee of Parliament on Electoral and Constitutional Reform, the establishment of which in 1991 arose from an agreement between the two parliamentary parties. Upon completion of the work of the Joint Select Committee, a constitutional commission was established to consider its interim report and make its own recommendations. This was sent back to the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, which issued its final report on May 31, 1995. Among other things, the committee recommended that a new Jamaican constitution be enacted, creating a Jamaican republic with the head of state being a president, who would be appointed on the nomination of the prime minister in consultation with the leader of the opposition, subject to parliamentary confirmation on a secret ballot by a 2/3 majority. The consensus broke down, however, on the question of how the 2/3 majority would be secured. The majority wanted this to be secured by a 2/3 majority of both houses of parliament voting in joint session. And when I say the majority wanted this, back then, this was the governing party, obviously, in parliament. The minority, that's the opposition, the parliamentary opposition, recommended that there be a confirmation by a 2/3 majority of each house voting separately. Another key recommendation was that the UK-based Privy Council would remain Jamaica's final court of appeal, subject to the introduction of a Caribbean court of appeal, if and when such a decision was made. And that was a very interesting recommendation with ramifications down the road. Significantly, the committee also recommended new provisions for fundamental rights and freedoms in the Jamaican Constitution. Fast forward to the year 2011, when this Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms was enacted as a new Chapter 3 of the Jamaican Constitution. And this remains the most significant component of the 1995 recommendations on constitutional reform to have been adopted. Outside of that, Jamaica remains a constitutional monarchy, and it continues to send appeals to His Majesty's Privy Council, despite the establishment of the Caribbean Court of Justice on February 14, 2001. Now for the current status of the constitutional reform process. On November 15 last year, the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, Marlene Malahou Fort, told the House of Representatives that Jamaica had approved the setting up of a constitutional reform committee, which will play a key role in ensuring Jamaica's smooth transition to a republic. She said it would comprise representatives from the government and opposition, the Attorney General, constitutional law experts, including persons from academia and the private sector. She acknowledged that much of the groundwork required to move away from the monarchy has been done through previous constitutional reviews, and that the committee will, and I quote here, provide some advice on the remaining work to be done and how the steps should be sequenced to implement those recommendations, end of quote. She added that the starting point will see focus on matters on which there is consensus, starting with those that are deeply entrenched. Well, on January 10, 2023, the minister told Parliament that the establishment of the Constitutional Reform Committee was being held up by the refusal of the parliamentary opposition to name its members to the committee. The leader of the opposition, Mark Golding, in response explained that this refusal was based on the fact that the government had so far not made clear its specific intentions in relation to amending the Charter of Rights, as well as those deeply entrenched provisions that require a referendum. The opposition, People's National Party, also wants the matter of accession to the appellate jurisdiction of the Caribbean Court of Appeal to be included in this phase of the constitutional reform process. The government wants to make that part 2 of the process. The government had set a timetable for the Constitutional Reform Committee to begin deliberations in January and continue into 2024, after which a referendum would be held. But due to the disagreement over the naming of the members to the Reform Committee, that decision has been put off until after the next round of Vale Royal talks between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. And just by way of explanation, the Vale Royal talks is the formal mechanism that was established a couple of decades ago for high-level discussions on important matters of national interest between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. And where we are now, the process, in a sense, has again been stalled pending the outcome of those Vale Royal talks in terms of when do we see ourselves becoming a republic, if that were ever to happen. Well, the process starts with the bill being tabled in Parliament. It lays there for 3 months between the first reading and the second reading. Then there's a debate and lapse of a further 3 months between the second reading and the third reading. And you're talking here now just about in the lower house before it goes to the Senate. And then it is put to the people in a referendum. So at a minimum, you're looking at 1 year. Given all that has been happening in terms of the toing and froing between government and opposition, it is not likely that we will see that taking place within the next 12 months. I'll pause there and we can perhaps address some of the matters arising later. Thank you.
Great, wonderful, wonderful reality checking the dynamics of moving from constitutional monarchy to republican in Jamaica. And I might add that the rethinking also has been voiced in St. Kitts Nevis and Antigua Barbuda. I've not followed their journey beyond dreaming to actually doing, but I would not be surprised if you've got similar issues of contention between what the vision of the formal governing party is and what the vision of the opposition party is in those two places. Thank you, colleagues, for those wonderful reality checking. We're moving now into the part of the conversation where we incorporate the thinking and questions from members of the viewing audience. What I'd like to do is the following. I want to put one question to all the panelists, even though all the panelists may not have spoken on this issue. And as we're now into the 20 minutes remaining, 25 minutes remaining for the program, I'd like to have as many people who want to respond to the question I'm going to put in a minute, do so, and then invite as part of some closing observations, every member of the panel to either comment on what has been said by another panelist or identify a question put in the Q&A for you to respond to, for you to address. So here's a question I'd like to have as many reflections on as possible, although again, not everyone in the panel would have addressed this issue, but I suspect everyone will have a view, a sentiment on it. And the question has to do with an issue raised by Annita, but also by Paul tangentially. And here's the question. What, if any, support has CARICOM received from its partners in the Cotonou Agreement in its complaints to the EU about unfair blacklisting for tax and money laundering? What, if any, developments are there between the US and CARICOM and the UK overseas territories with respect to responding to the global minimum tax? So this is a two-part question. Feel free to address colleagues both parts or just one part. And I'd like to begin by inviting Annita, and then we'll go to Paul, and then we'll go to Tim, and I'll ask Earl if he has any sentiment he'd like to express.
Thank you very much, Chair. As the issues and other challenges we've experienced with the EU, I'm not aware that there has been support from the side of the EU in considering revising the criteria of used for blacklisting countries or supporting CARICOM in that regard. As a matter of fact, as recently as 2021, even 2022, there was the list was updated by the UN. Some additional countries, 4 additional countries were placed on that blacklist. And in 2021, I think, I hope I have the date correctly, if my memory serves me right, at CARICOM's intersessional meeting, there was this discussion to have a discussion about that issue. Now, this is a pattern or a trend that we have seen in other areas, in terms of EU support on issues that are very important to them. So that is how I would answer that question. And I would allow my colleague, the other panelists, to answer the question about the overseas territories in terms of collaboration in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Not much. The essential situation is that the overseas countries and territories have received very little support, as far as I can tell, on virtually anything from CARICOM. Equally, when, for example, the economic partnership agreements were being negotiated many years ago, there was hardly any indication or interest. I think only 2 memorandums were prepared by the regional negotiating machinery dealing with the overseas countries and territories and the relationship with Europe. So they are peripheral to this. That said, of course, they have been very concerned with the matter. Up to now, it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe, which has been speaking on behalf of the countries, the advanced countries, which have, and I'm talking about developed countries here, as members of the OECD, who have particularly supported, shall we say, reform, but limited reform of tax justice system. And that, of course, is simply the overseas territories. Offshore finance systems would not exist without the City of London in Britain. City of London could stop it all tomorrow if it wanted. Britain could stop it all tomorrow, but they're not going to, because they make a fortune out of it, and they are created as offshore of the City of London. That's reality of the offshore financial territory. They've been guarded, they've been supported in this by the OECD. Now, the OECD have slowly brought reform forward, but not fast enough. And I think what you should do is to look at the fact that last year in November, in the United Nations General Assembly, there was a vote to look more seriously at the United Nations taking the initiative on looking at unfair taxation and on looking at offshore regulation. Look at the voting in that. I looked at the voting of it, interesting enough, only about 3 or 4 days ago. And the Caribbean countries were all supporting it, more or less. And that included places like Antigua, where Ambassador Ron Sanders has been very active in talking about the need for small countries to have space in the international financial system, to have tax competition policy. So that's how I look at it. I'm not aware CARICOM in itself is doing anything, but there we are.
Thank you. Tim, anything?
I'm struck, actually, that we have yet to mention guns and homicides. And obviously, those are inseparable from drugs. So I think there may be more pressures on money laundering than we're suggesting. And I'd also look at the endless case of Ambani and Mauritius, the amount of money that he was laundering through Mauritius, which of course is independent, is a role model. So I don't expect money laundering to be resolved anytime soon, but I think the flow of drugs and homicides may yet be the catalyst that will make at least something happen. And obviously that impacts tourism in the Caribbean significantly. Thank you.
Surely. Earl, any thoughts? The blacklisting?
I mostly pass on that, but my ears pricked up when I heard mention of guns and drugs, because that is emerging as it's certainly the movement of small arms into the region is emerging as an existential threat. And so matters related to that, perhaps the matter of money laundering related to that might help to spur some action. But believe me, this is, as I said, a near existential threat for the region.
Yep. Thank you all, colleagues. Let's do the following now as we approach the 11:30 hour on the East Coast. I'd like, in reverse order, starting with Earl, and then to go to Tim, and then Paul, and then Annita, to have you spend a minute or two commenting on anything said or not said as your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up thereafter.
Well, if I were to go back to my own presentation, I think that Jamaica, part of the reason for the stalemate in Jamaica on constitutional reform has to do with the lack of consensus up to this point on the matter of our final court. I think you may recall that the PNP, which is now in opposition, during its 18-year stretch, 18.5-year stretch as the government of Jamaica, had pushed very strongly for constitutional reform to include not just the matter of Jamaica becoming a republic, but that at the same time it should establish its own final court. And when I say its own final court, I mean that its preferred option would be to be part of a regional final court, which turned out to be the Caribbean Court of Justice. Jamaica acceded immediately to the trade component, which is an original jurisdiction, and sought to be part of the appellate jurisdiction. That was the legislation it enacted for that was challenged by a coalition of interests, so to speak. And ultimately the Privy Council, ironically, upheld the position that it had not gone about it in the correct way, and therefore the Caribbean Court of Justice Act 2004 was not passed in accordance with the procedures required by the Constitution and was declared void. That judgment was delivered in February 2005, and the PNP back in government in 2015 sought again to have it established as Jamaica's final court, the CCJ. It did not receive the parliamentary support of the opposition then, and therefore it was defeated. The then parliamentary opposition is now the government of Jamaica, has been since early 2016, and the opposition is seeking to have the two things done, meaning becoming a republic and establishing the CCJ as the country's final court, have to have both of them done. And the government is saying, let's not proceed with the two things simultaneously. Let's go for the Republican status first. And I think that's part of the problem. That's the reason why we're having this sort of toing and froing between government and opposition. I think the opposition is saying that it would not be consistent for us to become a republic and still have the UK-based Privy Council as our final court of appeal. The incumbent administration is saying, no, let's approach them separately. And so there's a great deal of suspicion and lack of trust between the two parties, the two dominant parties in Jamaica on this, but on how we approach this matter of delinking from the UK in totality.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a book coming out later this year from University of Illinois Press called Challenge Sovereignty. And I make the point in part of the book that the irony, and I extend the conversation beyond Jamaica to Trinidad in regard to the CCG. The irony is that these were two of the leading voices of regionalism in the decolonization era in the Caribbean. And the additional irony is that Trinidad spends millions of dollars every year hosting the court, but still refuses to be part of the appellate jurisdiction of the court.
And what's interesting about that situation is that the administration led by Basdeo Pandey, when Pandey was in office as prime minister, he supported having the CCJ as its final court. And I mean, Trinidad and Tobago benefited from being awarded the right to host the court. But once, as so often happens, when a party goes into opposition, when Pandey's party went into opposition, then they changed course and said, no, they would not support Trinidad and Tobago joining the CCJ.
I'm reminded of the old Miles law, where you stand depends on where you sit. Tim?
Yeah, just a couple of points that in part relate to your other book, Ivor Law, on the Guyanese boom. One of the very interesting aspects of being at UWI in St. Augustine is Trinidad as an industrial center for much of CARICOM. How that will last in a internet era, I'm not certain, and certainly Trinidad is having to recognize that its energy output is in decline, and that therefore at least some trained some trained Trinidadian energy experts are heading towards Guyana. And Annita can tell us, but obviously this shifts some of the dynamics of CARICOM, certainly towards the Southern Caribbean rather than towards the North. And obviously Jamaica in all sorts of ways has survived because of sandals and its relative proximity to North America as a tourism center. So I think that there's some very interesting dimensions arising in the case of Trinidad and Tobago as an industrial center, and whether they can survive as the global political economy changes. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, that's for sure. Paul and then Annita.
Yes, I'd like to take up a couple of issues that Earl raised there. First of all, on the issue of moving to Republican status, maybe given his process about the delaying tactics of the opposition, you should be in the position of Barbados, who everyone was surprised that went first, because of course they didn't have any opposition. They didn't delay anything, and now still haven't got an opposition following the elections. So maybe the best answer to that is get rid of your opposition, and fill all the seats in government, and then you'll become a republic. Secondly, on the issue of reparations, which was also raised by Earl, I want to declare an interest in here. I was a student at the University of Glasgow. I live in Glasgow. Glasgow is the first place in the United Kingdom to agree £20 million to be spent over 10 years in a memorandum of understanding signed between its Vice-Chancellor and Sir Hilary Beckles as Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, to partly compensate for the money which Glasgow, it's an old university, it's over 500 years old, got from the slave trade directly or indirectly. So Glasgow has done that, and I want to use that as an example, the first in the UK, now followed up by the family, the Trevelyan family in Grenada, which is in the news at the moment, say that I don't think any government is going to admit to reparations, but I think that institutions and people and families might. And I end up by citing the case at the moment of Sir Richard Drax, who the Barbados government is taking to court to ask him for his plantation back. Remember, it was the Drax family that established the first sugar plantation on Barbados. The original Drax went to Brazil to learn about it, came back and established plantation in the 1650s in Barbados. And on that basis, that plantation has been there ever since. There is a direct link. So institutions and people, but I don't think governments.
Thank you, Paul. Annita?
Thank you, Chair. As my closing remark, I want to address one of the comments question that was placed in the chat, and to just add some things concerning how to make the EU CARICOM relationship work or more effective, efficient, and more beneficial. I think one of the main things is we need to have more coherence in terms of the action of the EU towards the region and towards the other regions in the ACP. And what do I mean by that? You know, we speak about giving development financing and, you know, giving other sorts of assistance, technical assistance, and so to the Caribbean. At the same time, you know, we have a practice of blacklisting our economies, our countries, where correspondent banking, they lose correspondent banking privileges, and, you know, foreign investment is suffers, and those sorts of things. The other thing I'm thinking about is policy coherence in other international fora as well, because while we could get development assistance and other types, if there is a ruling in the WTO that affects our economies, then it basically trumps, you know, the whole effort. So one thing we need to do is to really push for policy coherence, not in the way they define it, but to think about our development priorities and ensure that we are not canceling. In terms of our relationship with the EU, we are not canceling aspects of the relationship that are supposed to be beneficial by others that we are doing. The other point I want to mention is the point I made about the question in response to the question about what has the EU done. You know, similarly, when it came to graduation, for example, where, you know, small economies that are vulnerable, that are, you know, susceptible to natural disasters and climate change and that sort of thing, when we are being classified as high income economies or high middle income economies or high income economies, using GDP as criteria, without thinking about the other things. For example, one hurricane can push back one Caribbean country by many years, 25 years, 30 years. And so I know that CARICOM countries have been advocating for redefining and coming up with new criteria, non-income based criteria. So these are the kinds of ways we want the EU to support us in terms of advancing our development agenda. We understand transferring of resources. These are important technical assistance, but we want the approach to be holistic, and we want there to be coherence. And also, and the last thing I want to say is in terms of the definition of development, because the kind of definition of development as a rights-based approach to development, what about the right to development and the right for Caribbean countries and Caribbean citizens to have a decent standard of living, and expanding that definition, or at least emphasizing as much on that as human rights and the other aspects. I'm not saying that they're not important, but I think that we need to have a balance, and we need to pursue those two as vigorously, that last one as vigorously as the rights-based approach to development. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, colleagues. I think if you were to take a poll of participants in this webinar as to the value added of this session, we'll get a resounding A+ insofar as things people will have been able to take away at the 1.5 hour compared to what they would have brought at the 10 o'clock hour. And so I want to thank all members of the panel for the splendid presentations and response to questions and their own commentary. But let me also thank the woman behind the scenes who has been the technical Zarina, the logistics Zarina, Lindsay Dudley from LAC, and the media guy in the IT center, Carlos, and all the colleagues at LAC and the colleagues at the CPC for enabling us to have a wonderful additional conversation in this partnership between FIU and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. Let me also take the opportunity to thank all the participants, wherever you may have been, whether in the United States, in the Caribbean, or in Europe. Thank you for enabling us to have another reality check on things happening in different parts of the world that are relevant to the Caribbean. Have a wonderful rest of the day, wonderful rest of the evening, wherever you are, and look forward to further conversations. Thank you.